If you don't know how to connect your pen display to your computer, or you're struggling to make it work, you should watch this video. A pen display has three key requirements to work. It has to get enough power, it has to be able to send data to your computer, and it has to receive a video signal from your computer. If any of those key requirements are not met, the pen display will not work correctly. Connecting a pen display is really how we use cables to meet those requirements. Broadly speaking, there are two approaches to cabling. In one cabling system, the video is provided by an HDMI cable. In the other cabling system, the video is provided with a USB-C cable. In this video, I'm going to be covering the system that uses an HDMI cable. I'm going to cover how to attach to HDMI ports. And if you don't have an HDMI port, you might have other ports that can send a video signal. So I'll tell you how to use adapters to convert video signals from those ports into HDMI. I will briefly touch upon the USB-C cabling system just to show you what it looks like. The USB-C cabling system requires fewer cables, but understanding how it works is much more complicated. I will have a separate video for the USB-C cabling system. Even if you do want to use USB-C, I strongly suggest you watch this video, because you'll learn things in this video that will prepare you for that discussion. Imagine a pen display has three ports, one for power, one for data, and one for video. These ports would connect with three cables. The three cables connect to the three ports on the computer. The power cable has a red connector to make it obvious that it is used for power. Instead of three cables, many pen displays use a 3-in-1 cable. On one end, there's a USB-C connector that goes to the pen display. On the other end, the cable splits into three separate cables to individually handle power, data, and video. This is a picture of a typical 3-in-1 cable. Here's a close-up photo of the three ends that connect to the computer. As you can see, the power connector really is red. The diagrams you've already seen show you three kinds of ports: USB-A, USB-C, and HDMI. So here's a quick reference to help you identify each one. I've also included DisplayPort because it is so common. Pen displays use a lot of power, and the vast majority of power that they need is for the screen. The bigger the pen display gets, the more power it needs. As they get bigger, at some point your computer will not be able to give enough power through any of its ports. So in this case, you will use a 3-in-1 cable, but connect it to a separate power adapter. Usually this power adapter comes with the tablet, but sometimes you have to purchase them separately. To help reach power adapters that may be at some distance from the computer, many tablets also come with a power extension cable. I have to emphasize, you must connect all three cables, because if you don't, something will not work correctly. It is so common that someone forgets to connect one of the cables. I'm going to explain what happens in each case. If the data cable is not connected, then the tablet driver will say that the tablet is not connected. It will even say this if you see something on the tablet screen. Because the tablet driver cannot get data about the pen from the tablet, if you move your pen on the tablet, nothing will happen. This is what the tablet driver will tell you when the data cable is not connected. Though do be aware, this kind of message might appear for other reasons, even if the data cable is correctly connected. If you don't connect the power cable, different things can happen. For small tablets that don't require a lot of power, your tablet might actually function correctly. If this works at all, it's because the data cable is getting enough power from the USB-A port on the computer. But keep in mind, not all USB-A ports will provide that much power. On the other hand, if the tablet is not getting enough power, you might see other things happen. For example, the screen might just be black and the power button on the tablet may not even light up. Or you might see that the tablet goes through a cycle where it briefly turns on for half a second and then goes black for about 3 seconds, and this may repeat over and over. If you don't connect the video cable, then your tablet has nothing to show you on its screen. However, in this case, you'll see a message on the screen that says no signal. And then it might also say power saving. These messages will appear for a few seconds, and then the tablet will just turn off. The no signal message means that the tablet is not getting a video signal from the computer. The most common reason, of course, is that the HDMI cable is not connected. However, it is very possible that you get the no signal message for many other reasons, even if the cable is connected properly. Debugging a no signal problem can be very challenging. In a few months, I'll make a detailed video about it. The power saving message confuses a lot of people. This message does not mean that the tablet is not getting enough power. We know the tablet is getting enough power, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't show you this message. So definitely the tablet is getting enough power. This message is trying to say, I am the tablet and I don't have anything to show you on the screen. So I am trying to be environmentally friendly by turning myself off and not wasting power. So if you see the power saving message, you do not have to worry about power. That is not the problem. I do want to clarify one thing about the no signal power saving behavior. Since there's no signal, there's nothing to show on the screen, and power saving, at least for some tablets, doesn't actually turn off the tablet entirely. It just turns off the screen. So for those tablets, the pen will actually work normally. And effectively, the pen display works just like a screenless pen tablet. Some brands even advertise this as a feature of their pen displays. And some people deliberately disconnect the video cable just so that they can use the tablet in this way. On occasion, I've done that, because instead of having both a pen display and a screenless pen tablet plugged in, I can just use a single pen display and disconnect the video as I need. Not all pen displays support this behavior, but I think many, maybe most of them do. At the very least, it's nice that you can still use the tablet to draw, even if you can't see anything on it. The diagrams you've seen show two USB-C ports on the pen display, and this is very common for modern pen displays. However, which USB-C port should you use to connect the 3-in-1 cable? Some tablets want you to use the top port, some tablets want you to use the bottom port, and some tablets let you use either port. The most reliable way to find out which port to use is to read the user manual for the tablet. The manual will include some diagrams showing exactly where these cables go. Generally, 3-in-1 cables are designed to work with specific tablets. So, for example, you should not assume that you can mix and match 3-in-1 cables between Wacom and Huion and XP Pen. In fact, you can't even assume that you can mix and match within a specific brand. So, for example, a 3-in-1 cable designed for one Huion tablet may not work with another Huion tablet. So if you need to get a 3-in-1 cable to replace one that is broken, or maybe your tablet didn't come with one, then please verify the compatibility of the 3-in-1 cable with your specific tablet. The compatibility information should be listed on the brand's online store. But if you're having trouble finding it, you can always contact customer support. Not all tablets use exactly 3-in-1 cables. There are some slightly different designs for cabling. One popular system uses two cables. One cable is dedicated for power, and the other cable is a 2-in-1 cable that provides data and video from the computer. Another alternative is the 3-in-2 cable. This cable has two USB-C connectors that connect to the pen display. This video is about cabling systems that use HDMI for video, but just for a brief moment, I'd like to show you how the cabling works when you're using USB-C for video. In some cases, it is possible to use a single USB-C cable to get power, data, and video from your computer. But I have to be clear, though, that this scenario has very special requirements for the USB-C cable and special requirements for the USB-C port on your computer. And certainly, not all cables and ports can be used for this purpose. There's another variation that uses two USB-C cables. One USB-C cable is connected to the power adapter, and the other USB-C cable gets data and video from the computer. As I mentioned earlier, using USB-C cables with pen displays gets complicated, and I will cover this in a separate video. Now let's get back to HDMI connections. The first topic is how to connect an HDMI cable to an HDMI port. This may sound too basic and unnecessary, but you would be surprised. There are some real complications here. Some HDMI ports will not work for you, and some HDMI ports are better to use than other HDMI ports. Let's start with the simple cases. If you have a laptop with an HDMI port, then this HDMI port will work for you to connect your pen display. If you have a mini PC that has one or more HDMI ports, then these HDMI ports will work to connect your pen display. However, things get really kind of complicated when we talk about desktop PCs. This is the back of my desktop PC. There are 24 ports here. I will hide all the ports that are not capable of sending a video signal. This leaves 7 ports. Of those 7, there are 2 HDMI ports. Notice that these 2 HDMI ports are in different general locations, and those locations matter. The HDMI port on the left is in a region called the motherboard I/O panel. I/O stands for input-output. The HDMI port on the right is on the graphics card. We often call the graphics card the GPU, which stands for Graphics Processing Unit. The GPU, formally speaking, is actually a component on the graphics card, but people often use the word GPU to indicate the entire graphics card. I know many of you are really interested in creating art and drawing, and don't want to get deep into technology, but I'm going to give you some more detail about the terminology here. Because if you need help from someone, knowing the meanings of these words and knowing what parts these are will help you in those conversations. This is the motherboard of my desktop PC. What you see is a bare bones motherboard. If you open up my computer, you will see that there are actually many more things attached to this motherboard. On the bottom left of this motherboard, you can see the I/O panel with its many ports. The motherboard also has these 3 rectangular slots. The exact number of slots depends on the specific motherboard. Usually, the slot closest to the I/O panel is where the GPU or graphics card is plugged in. This is the GPU or graphics card. At the bottom, you can see the piece that goes into the slot on the motherboard. And on the back of this graphics card are the ports. The purpose of all the ports on the GPU is to send a video signal. Returning to the back of the desktop PC, we see a motherboard HDMI port and a GPU HDMI port. The first choice you have to make is to pick between these two. And which one should you pick? The answer is, you should always prefer to use the GPU HDMI port first. You should treat the motherboard HDMI port as a port of last resort. Only use the motherboard HDMI if you have no other option. Here are all my reasons why a motherboard HDMI port should be the last resort. First, motherboard HDMI ports are not as high performance as GPU HDMI ports. To be honest, these days you can find motherboard HDMI ports can be very, very good, but GPU HDMI ports are just better because GPUs are really powerful. Second, you may have a motherboard HDMI port that just doesn't work. This is because some motherboards have the physical HDMI port there, but they don't have the necessary additional hardware on the motherboard to make that HDMI port work. And this is not a mistake or a defect, it's just the reality of how manufacturers choose parts for their PCs. Third, you might have a motherboard HDMI port that, in theory, should work because the port is there and the hardware on the motherboard to make it work is there. However, that port might be disabled. It may be possible to re-enable the port by going into the computer's BIOS system and re-enabling it. However, the process of going into the BIOS system to change things is complicated. It requires some technical expertise, and the specific steps are not standardized across different motherboard types. So this could be very challenging for you, and you may need to seek technical assistance from somebody else. Fourth, I have heard that some motherboards have HDMI ports that do work, but the moment you plug in a GPU, the motherboard forcibly disables the motherboard HDMI port, because apparently they really want you to use the GPU ports. So for all these reasons, I say that the motherboard HDMI port is the port of last resort. If you're looking for HDMI ports on your PC, you should be aware that sometimes these ports are hidden. Sometimes they are covered by these little plastic caps. These caps are usually black and sometimes very hard to see. There's actually a cap on one of the ports on my motherboard. It's protecting a port labeled DP-in. These caps are not stuck in there. They are very easy to remove. It hardly requires any effort. These caps do not mean that the port cannot be used. They are there to protect the port from damage and to prevent things like dust or lint from getting inside the port. I really needed to mention these caps because I've seen a lot of people look for a port, but they just can't find it because it's being hidden by one of these caps. What do you do if you don't have enough HDMI ports? There are a lot of options, and some are better than others. Here is the most common situation. The computer has one HDMI port, but that port is already connected to a monitor. The first thing you should realize is many monitors can connect to your computer with different kinds of cables. For example, Many monitors support connection with DisplayPort cables. So if your computer has a DisplayPort port, then connect the monitor to the DisplayPort port and then connect the pen display to the HDMI port. Sometimes, in this situation, when someone has a single HDMI port and thinking that they need two HDMI ports, they will buy an HDMI splitter. An HDMI splitter connects to the computer's HDMI port, and then the monitor and pen display are connected to the HDMI splitter. I don't recommend using an HDMI splitter. First, I find that they can be very flaky. They can sometimes introduce compatibility or quality issues, and these are issues you would not encounter if you were using a normal, direct HDMI connection. Second, splitters give you two HDMI ports, but these ports are not independent. They will always send the same exact video signal. So your monitor and your pen display will see the same exact thing at the same resolution and refresh rate. If that is what you want, then okay. But what many people really want is to see two separate things, one thing on the monitor and a separate thing on the pen display. And an HDMI splitter can never give you that. And third, just as a note, when you are using an HDMI splitter, your computer thinks that it is connected to a single monitor, that monitor being the HDMI splitter. Your computer has no idea that there are two other displays attached behind the splitter. So, for example, if you went into your operating system's display settings, it would not show you two displays. It would always show you one, and that one is the splitter. This can confuse a lot of people when they use a splitter, so I just want to make sure you understand this. Some computers don't have a GPU installed, so buying a GPU with an HDMI port and installing it is one option. In other cases, you might have a GPU already with one HDMI port, and you might be able to find a GPU with two HDMI ports. But to be truthful, it's getting kind of hard to find a GPU with more than one HDMI port. These days, GPUs tend to have one HDMI port, but multiple DisplayPort ports. Take a look at these two GPUs. They have all sorts of ports: DisplayPort, HDMI, DVI, and USB-C. And naturally, because these ports are on a GPU, they are designed to send a video signal. I will show you how to connect all of these ports to the HDMI cable for your pen display using an adapter. For reference, here are all the ports that you could conceivably use for a video signal. The only one I have not showed you already is the VGA port at the bottom. While we are looking at these ports, I want to make a few points about them. First, let's start with the USB-C ports. While every other port in this list is designed to carry a video signal, a USB-C port may or may not carry a video signal. If the USB-C port is on a graphics card, then it will carry a video signal, but if it isn't, then it requires some extra research. But don't worry, later in the video I will explain exactly how to identify USB-C ports that support video. The second thing I want to point out is that some of these ports carry a digital video signal, and some carry an analog video signal. And some of them can support either analog or digital video signals. To use these ports with an HDMI cable, we need an HDMI adapter. The adapter will connect to the computer, and then the HDMI cable will connect to the adapter. All of these adapters have a male connector that goes to the computer and a female HDMI end for the HDMI cable. Before I cover the specific adapters for each kind of port, I want to share some general thoughts about HDMI adapters. First, I always think it's better not to have to use an adapter, because even the existence of an adapter is one more component that might introduce a problem. Having said that, I have used many HDMI adapters and I've had great experiences with them, especially DisplayPort to HDMI adapters. But I have to admit, certain combinations of ports and displays and adapters and resolutions and refresh rates can be flaky. Another really important thing to remember is that you have to verify whether an adapter supports the resolution and refresh rate that you need. For example, you might have a 4K pen display that you want to use with a refresh rate of 60 Hz. However, you might find that some adapters can do full HD at 60 Hz, but they can only do 4K at 30 Hz. Earlier, I mentioned that some ports are digital and some ports are analog. In general, if you are going to use an adapter, I think it's always better to get an adapter that goes digital to digital. If an adapter is converting analog to digital, Some people say this can introduce some quality issues with the video signal. And finally, if you're dealing with a USB-C to HDMI adapter, you are going to have to verify that your USB-C port is capable of carrying a video signal. I will talk extensively about how to do that later in this video. DisplayPort is the most popular port on GPUs, and I believe you will have the most success if you use a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter. I've used these adapters many times. I found them to be reliable, and they're very commonly used. Be aware that there are different port shapes for DisplayPort. The classic full-size DisplayPort is on the left. This is the most common one you'll see. You might also find a mini DisplayPort. That's the one in the middle. Mini DisplayPort does exactly the same thing as the full-size DisplayPort. It's got the same performance and capabilities, it's just a different connector shape. And finally, we have Thunderbolt 1 and Thunderbolt 2 ports. You tend to see these ports on older MacBooks and Apple-related devices. These ports have exactly the same shape as Mini DisplayPort. These Thunderbolt ports are essentially a superset of Mini DisplayPort. So any Mini DisplayPort adapter will fit into these ports and they'll work perfectly. For DisplayPort, the adapters look like this. Again, these are male DisplayPort to female HDMI ports. And I'll also take this time to remind you, please verify that the adapter you're buying supports the refresh rate and resolution that you need. DVI ports are a little bit of an older technology. You don't see them so much on PCs these days. DVI to HDMI adapters look different. They tend to have this compact shape. DVI has multiple port types, and these port types are physically different. Not all DVI connectors fit in all DVI ports. If you're going to buy a DVI to HDMI adapter, you have to make sure it fits into the port that you have. Now let's talk about VGA ports. VGA ports are really old. They are rarely seen these days. Honestly, VGA is what I would consider a last resort choice. VGA is always analog, so it has to get converted to a digital video signal for HDMI. Some people say that this conversion process reduces the quality of the video signal. At this point, I would normally be talking about USB-C to HDMI adapters, but I'm going to pause that for a few minutes. I need to spend some time telling you how to determine if a USB-C port handles video. The most important thing to remember about USB-C is, just because you have a computer with a USB-C port, that does not mean anything. It does not tell you that the USB-C port supports video. Broadly speaking, USB-C is a standard for the shape of the port and the connector that fits into it. And just having a USB-C port doesn't tell you anything about what the port can do. Some USB-C ports are intended just to deliver power. Some deliver power and data. And they can vary quite a bit with how much data they can provide and how much power they can provide. And yes, some USB-C ports can send a video signal, but others cannot. When a USB-C port handles video, we say that it supports DisplayPort Alternative Mode, or more often we just say DP Alt Mode. So how do you tell if a USB-C port handles DisplayPort Alt Mode? Well, you certainly can't just look at the port and rely on its shape, but there are many other clues. If you see a DisplayPort symbol next to a USB-C port, that means it handles DisplayPort Alt Mode. If you see a Thunderbolt symbol next to a USB-C port, and Thunderbolt means that it does support DP Alt Mode. The Thunderbolt symbol has a very specific shape. However, sometimes you might see this other kind of lightning bolt symbol, but that is not a Thunderbolt symbol. This other symbol indicates that the port can send power. It has nothing to do with Thunderbolt or DP Alt Mode. Here are two Thunderbolt USB-C ports on the back of my PC. Keep in mind that both of these ports are on the motherboard, and so while I do expect them to support video, I would prefer not to use them. I would rather use the ports on the GPU. This is a Thunderbolt 4 port on my M3 MacBook Pro. There is no Thunderbolt symbol next to it, so the only way that I know it's a Thunderbolt 4 port is because I read the user manual. This USB-C port is on a GPU. There's no label here of any kind, but the purpose of a GPU is to send a video signal through its ports. So this USB-C port certainly does support DP Alt Mode. However, just in case, I suggest you read the user manual or contact customer support to verify this. The USB 4 standard also uses USB-C style connectors and ports, and all USB 4 ports can handle DP Alt Mode. There are two USB 4 ports on the back of my mini PC. They are not labeled in any way. And so, again, the only reason I know that they are USB 4 ports is that I looked it up in the user manual. And just to emphasize this one more time, if you have a USB-C port, you should always verify that it supports DP alt mode. You can do this by reading the documentation or by contacting customer support. Now that we know that some USB-C ports are capable of handling video because they support DP alt mode, now we can talk about using a USB-C to HDMI adapter. They look just like this. And as long as you have the correct kind of USB-C port, adapters like this should work. An alternative to adapters is to use Thunderbolt docks. Typically, these docks are intended for laptops that have Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4 ports. And they provide many additional ports, not just HDMI. For example, here's a smaller one listed on the Apple Store. And here's a more elaborate one I found on Amazon. I personally use this CalDigit TS4 Thunderbolt dock. And no, it does not have an HDMI port. It does have a DisplayPort port, and so I actually use a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter with this dock. If you are going to use a Thunderbolt dock, you should be aware they have some rules about which kinds of USB-C ports they work with. From what I've gathered, they seem to work well when plugged into Thunderbolt 4 ports, Thunderbolt 3 ports, and USB 4 ports. But some Thunderbolt docks may be incompatible with USB 3.x USB-C ports. At the very least, I can share my experience. I've used the CalDigit TS4 dock with Thunderbolt 4 ports and with USB 4 ports on several devices, and it's worked perfectly. But ultimately, I am not an expert on the topic of Thunderbolt docks, so please do your compatibility research before you purchase a Thunderbolt dock. Okay, that was a lot to cover. If you have questions or feedback, please leave a comment. Thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this video.